Okay, hello, I'm Professor Bardale, and this is probably the first ever lecture on George Berkeley from the Portland airport. So I'll try to speak up here. I think the background noise is pretty good here. We'll probably go for about an hour and then have some discussion afterwards, led by Dave Nichols, my trusty assistant. So, let's see. Let's try this. Logistics here are new, so, alright. The best way to understand Berkeley is by looking at Locke. So, if you've probably noticed that the two dialogues between Hylas and Philonous is in the form of dialogue, and Philonous represents the view of Berkeley. And by the way, Berkeley is pronounced Berkeley, it's not Berkeley. Why is it that the University of California is called Berkeley? I think somebody mispronounced his name. It actually is named University of California at Berkeley, is named after George Berkeley, but his name's pronounced Berkeley and not Berkeley. So, and there will be a test question on this. So you want to say, oh, we studied the philosopher Berkeley, what a weirdo. And as my former Professor Robertson used to say, you don't want to embarrass yourself at a cocktail party and say, oh yes, that George Berkeley character. And people will say, oh, he said Berkeley. It'll be like Trump quoting from 2 Corinthians instead of 2 Corinthians. So don't embarrass yourself. It's Berkeley. Remember, it's like bark like a dog. So Philonous represents Berkeley's view, and then Hylas represents Locke's view. So this is a bit like the Apology of Plato, where you basically get Berkeley's view, and then you get Locke sort of being portrayed as easily led, easily confused, and generally, not very good at making his case. Although he has his moments here, and I think Berkeley tries to give him a fair shake, but he always ends up with the short end of the stick. So it's pronounced Berkeley. Hylas represents Locke's view in the dialogue, and Philonous represents Berkeley's view. So remember, Locke has this view. He's an empiricist. Locke's the first empiricist we've looked at, and he has this idea that there's the real world out there, and we get in touch with it via the senses. So through the 5 senses, we get we get the simple ideas or the qualities. So remember, simple ideas are things like redness or squareness or sweetness or softness. These are things that come from the 5 senses. They come to us individually, and then our mind sort of puts them together in the form of an object and adds this concept of substance, this thing that makes all the qualities kind of hang together, and thus turning the simple idea into a complex idea of an object, which has substance. So Locke has this idea of substance, which, as I said at the end of the last lecture, is not a very empiricist idea. Why not? Well, as Berkeley points out, you can't sense substance. Substance is this kind of rationalist idea where you can't imagine these sense qualities existing sort of disembodied in space on their own. So you imagine some substance in which they exist. And Locke, makes this kind of conceptual a priori argument that there has to be a quote-unquote real world. There has to be an external world of matter which is responsible for our experiences. So the the real world is the world of matter, the world of material substance, the world of material substratum, the world of the substratum just by itself. All those terms are used by both Berkeley and Locke to describe the material world. And so you think about a particular material object, it's part of the material world, it has substance, or you can use the word thing. Thing and object are relatively synonymous. And so you have a thing or an object which has qualities. So sugar, an object, or I think we'd say substance, right? It has qualities like being granular and white and sweet. So there are 3 different qualities which apply to sugar. Then we have a concept of sugar which represents that substance to our mind, made up of the simple ideas. So simple ideas, granularity, whiteness, sweetness, and then the complex idea. So those are all qualities, right? And then the complex idea of the sugar, which is the idea of a substance. It's a complex idea made up of the simple ideas. And just to remind you of one more thing about the primary-secondary distinction. So Locke says a quality is an equality. Some qualities they actually inhere in the object themselves. There are some qualities that are really there, like shape. An object, according to Locke, really has shape, and it doesn't really depend on our senses, whether the shape is there or not. The same thing with size. The same thing with mass and density, temperature. Those are all primary qualities. Secondary qualities aren't really in the object. They're things like color. So the reason why we see objects as colored, say see red objects as red, is because light bounces off those objects at a certain wavelength, and then our eyes convert that into a sensation. But the redness is not out there in the world. The redness is in us. So he would define redness as a secondary quality. It's the power of certain objects to create red sensations in us via their primary qualities. So any secondary quality is the power of an object to create certain sensations in us, which are partly subjective. Partly objective, though, because something is really happening, right? Light's really coming into that wavelength. It's just that the redness, the red sensation created by that wavelength is an eccentricity of human nature. Human beings see that wavelength as red, unless they're colorblind, in which they just see shades of gray. So that's the secondary quality. The power of an object to create certain sensations in us through their primary qualities. So qualities, though, whether they're primary or secondary, are represented by simple ideas, and then you get a bunch of qualities together. Granularity, what would that be? Well, that's a primary quality, right? Whiteness, that, I guess that's technically color, even though white's not a color. That would be that would probably be a secondary quality. Sweetness would be a secondary quality. Taste, smell, and color are all reliant on the way our taste buds work, the way our olfactory glands work. Oops. There for the thumb there in the picture. I was trying to keep my laptop screensaver coming on. I'm looking at the whiteboard notes here. So the primary qualities are actually there in the object. The secondary ones are in part created by us. So Berkeley is going to come along and dispute the primary-secondary distinction, and even dispute the difference between an object and an idea. So for Berkeley, it's all ideas. It's just minds and ideas. Now, Locke is more common sense. Like I said, he has this real world of matter, and then it's represented to our minds via ideas, right? You have the idea in your mind, and it represents the object out there in the world. You have the idea of the tree in your mind, and that represents an object out there that's, green and leafy and tall, and, has all these qualities. And the sort of a mental copy in your mind that makes you aware of the tree. So you're aware not of the tree directly, according to Locke. You're aware of the tree via this mental representation in your mind. And if everything's working right, that mental representation matches up with the tree out there in the world. It corresponds to theory of truth, right? Your belief about the tree or beliefs are true if and only if the tree actually is that way. Okay, so and this again assumes a kind of representationalist view. There's a section in the text about direct realism, which is this idea that we're not aware of ideas in our minds, but we're directly aware of the external world, and in the text they give you all sorts of reasons to be suspicious of that idea. And all of the empiricists we look at, they assume representationalism. Direct realism is really sort of a modern view to try to get around some of these skeptical problems. G.E. Moore is famous for his demonstration that at least two objects exist in the world. He says, here's a hand, here's a hand. I don't know if I have to use my other hand here. Okay, there's a hand. There's a hand and there's a hand. There, I've just proved at least two objects exist in the external world. And the idea is that you don't have to prove it. It's just sort of obvious, just by demonstration. And these skeptical problems get started when you say, okay, well, I have these ideas that I'm aware of, and I wonder, do they really represent anything out there in the world? And so you have to constantly worry about how am I going to get to these ideas that are in here, and then get to the world that's out there. And there's this big gap, and that big gap you get Descartes' dream argument, and our deceiver, and now Berkeley, who's questioning, well, how do we know these ideas come from this external world of matter? What is this world of matter? What is this substance? And you remember Locke defines substance as this something I know not what, which supports qualities. So we have this intuitive idea that there's a real world out there, that it's not just ideas, it's not just mental stuff, but there's a real world of matter out there that's the cause of my sensations. And Locke accepts that sort of as kind of a presupposition. It's a presupposition of reason, I think you would say, and he makes again this sort of conceptual argument. Well, it's just sort of absurd to think that there could be all these sensations that we're having without something that's causing them, and have all these qualities that just exist disembodied without inhering in some substance. So that's just a common sense notion of material objects, of a thing, of the world of matter, and which is the cause of our sensations. And but this assumes this representationalist view. Berkeley almost goes to the direct realist view, except for instead of saying we directly observe the world of matter, he says we directly observe the sensations. So again, there's a good test question for those of you who haven't taken the test. This is also in the review questions. The concept of substance isn't a very good empiricist idea, and that's because you can't directly see substance. You don't directly see a material object, according to Locke. What happens is you get qualities from the object, your mind puts them together into the concept of the object, but you don't directly sense the object. You have all these sensations, your mind puts it together in the form of a complex idea, and then there's this inference that the idea is being caused by something I know not what, a material object. And that's that kind of a priori reasoning not using the senses, but saying, here, I'm having all these sensations, something has to be causing them, logically. And that's Locke's argument essentially for substance, that to assume the opposite is just absurd. It doesn't make any sense. And so if you're making an argument for what's true based on what makes sense or what seems, to make it be logically true, that's a Cartesian argument. That's an a priori argument. So let's see. So the rationalists love a priori arguments, and the empiricists say, no, stick to the senses. To find out whether something's real, you have to use the five senses, and all knowledge comes to the five senses. So that's Berkeley's view. And he's going to take Locke to task for this concept of substance. Okay, let's see. So Berkeley is an empiricist, and he starts out with his attack on the concept of matter. And Berkeley's favorite slogan is this phrase, to be is to be perceived. To be is to be perceived. Now what does that mean? Well, to be, to exist, right? Hamlet's old, to be or not to be. Well, then he's going to kill himself or not, cease to exist. So to be is to be perceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in order for something, or it means to say something exists is to say some mind is having an experience. So to say X exists is to say someone's having an idea of X. Someone's having an experience of a certain sort. And according to Berkeley, it doesn't make any sense to talk about something existing if there's no experience. To exist is for there to be an experience. So to put it in kind of metaphysical terms, only minds and ideas exist. So there are minds, or there are ideas, and then minds that have those ideas, or which are aware of those ideas. So this is good. One way of illustrating this is this question: if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? And somebody like Locke would say, well, it depends on what you mean by sound. If you're talking about sound as a sort of a secondary quality, then in a way, yes, because the tree compresses airwaves and causes sound waves, and so it kind of jostles the air molecules, and so that we could call that a sound. It's sort of a primary qualities generating what someone would hear if they were there. So Locke would say, if by sound you mean disturbance in the air molecules, in the material world, then he would say, sure, it makes a sound. If you're talking about that which is heard, you might say the idea of sensation, the actual sound that you hear, the mental representation or sensation of the sound, then no, right? So one's out there in the material world, the other one's in the mind. So there's the disturbance of the air molecules, and according to Locke, again, that causes our sensation of that, telltale cracking and falling and crashing. Now, what's Berkeley going to say about this? Well, Berkeley's going to say, no, it doesn't make a sound, because sound, by definition, is that which is heard. And who knows, how can you tell how can you tell that it's even, what does it even mean to say that something makes a sound? It means that someone has a certain experience. Again, to be is to be perceived. Sorry, a little distracted with all the chatter here. People wandering by. Okay, so So to be is to be perceived. So for the tree to exist and for it to make a sound, then it means that someone has to have an experience of the tree. For even the tree to exist, someone has to be experiencing the tree. So, okay. So, according to Berkeley, if nobody hears it, then it's not a sound, because sound, by definition, is that which is heard. So someone always hears a sound. So again, Locke has this idea that God created the material world, and then we have ideas, sensations, and experiences directly from this material world. And then with Berkeley, you just have the ideas and sensations, experiences come directly from God. So, Berkeley sees himself as cutting out the middleman, and he sees Locke as sort of being the ally of skeptics and atheists by concocting this philosophical abstraction of the material world and saying that God is not the author of our experiences. So, now Berkeley also claims to be the friend of common sense. So he thinks that Locke is positing this sort of confused philosophical theory, and again giving ammunition to these skeptics and atheists. Now Berkeley's a bishop, and he wants to build up people's faith, and he wants to stick it to the atheists. But don't write Berkeley off as just a religious nut, because even though Berkeley has obviously a strong religious element, this question about the coherence of the idea of a world of matter as a cause of our sensations is a deep question, and it's an important skeptical question. And the idea of what words mean in ordinary language, of what a sound is. Berkeley's getting at some deep things, and I think that don't get lost in this idea that he's sort of some guy that's involved in church and he's a bishop and so on, because Berkeley's arguments are fairly strong, and they if you look at David Hume, for example, a lot of his arguments are just cribbed from Berkeley and these skeptical arguments. So Berkeley, though, claims to be not a skeptic but the friend of common sense. You'll see in the dialogue, there's this question: who's the real skeptic? And they have this discussion, and Hylas says, well, the person who's a skeptic is the person that denies something, and then Philonous says, well, denies what? So because whenever you have a disagreement, each person is denying the other person's point of view, and so we see Hylas sort of incredulous that Philonous would deny the existence of material substance, but Philonous makes this point that really is that really common sense to believe in a world of matter? Isn't this concept of matter philosophical theory? Is it really something that you learn in your experience, or is it something that is sort of laid on top of it? Okay, so one way to look at Berkeley's view is it's sort of like the arch deceiver, except for it's not really deceptive. It's only deceptive if you think there's a quote-unquote real world apart from your sensations. But that's not something that comes in your experience. That's an inference you make, or that's just an idea that gets into your head if you hang out with somebody like Hylas, right? And so he thinks it's God is the author of your experience. There's no physical or material world, but this whole idea of the physical and material world is a concoction of philosophers. So the world is sort of like the Matrix or the Archiever, the Brain of the Bat scenario, but it's not really deceptive. It's only deceptive if you convince yourself that there's this world of matter. And he thinks that God didn't set up the world so that it looks like there's this world of matter. And again, he thinks common sense shows you that what is a sound? That which is heard. What do you see? Well, you see visual ideas. And isn't God the author of everything? Well, of course he is. Well, then what's this material world? Why not just say that God authors our experience directly? And what evidence is there to the contrary? So that's sort of his argument. Okay. Bit. So Berkeley starts out with this attack on the concept of matter and makes a couple of arguments against it. As I said at the beginning, there's this question about who's the real skeptic, and so they're talking, and Philonis says, you wouldn't believe what somebody said about you the other night. I was at this party, and somebody said that you believe the most extravagant thing. And he's like, well, what's that? Well, that there's no such thing as material substance. And Philonis cops to it and says, I don't believe in material substance. And then they launch into this discussion. That's sort of the first part of the dialogue. And so after they get around this sort of who's the real skeptic question, they get to the meat of the issue, and you get basically Hylas lays out Locke's representationalism. He says, well, first of all, there's the object, and then there's the sensations that are in my mind. And the object's made of material substance, and the things in my mind represent that substance to my conscious awareness. It's fairly simple theories, the way Locke sees things, and then Philonis asks this question. He says, "Material substratum, call you it? Pray, by which of your senses came you to be acquainted with that being?" So the question is, you believe in this material substance, Hylas, and you say you're an empiricist. So how did you become aware of this? Did you see it? Did you touch it? Did you taste it? Did you smell it? Which of your senses did you become aware of it? And then Hylas says, well, none of my senses. I just I think about all these sensations I'm having, and I think they have to be coming from somewhere, and so I come up with this concept of the material world. And Berkeley rightly points out that this isn't a very empiricist idea. He's assuming that this must be the way things are. Why? Because it's hard for him to imagine that it could be otherwise. And so Berkeley sees, through Philonis, the character, takes him to task for this. And then he says, well, look at this. It gets into the primary-secondary thing, which the difference between primary and secondary qualities. And they're looking at this tulip, and Hylas says, well, take for example that tulip. The tulip's out there in the world, and it's got these colors in it, but the colors are partly me. And then so Berkeley says, but where's the shape of the tulip? Well, it's right there. That's the extension. Shape and size is right there. Where's the color? Is the color the same place as the shape and size, or is it a different place? Nope, in the same place. Well, then how can one be in this supposed external world of matter and the other one be in my mind? because you can never see a shape without a color. You can never see a color without a shape. And when you look at the tulip, the color and the shape are in the same place. So either they're both in this supposed external world of matter, or, as Polonus wants to argue, they're both in your mind. He gives this other argument against Polonus, this sort of idea of representationalism. He says, well, okay, tell me about this external world of matter. What is it like? And Hylas says, well, it's stable, it's unchanging, it's sort of those two things, I suppose. It's stable and unchanging. Whereas, what's thought like? Well, thoughts come and go with great rapidity, back and forth. Your mind's always changing. So then he asks this question: well, how can a stable, unchanging material world be represented by an ever-changing, fleeting a world of ideas? So that how can you represent one thing with something that's totally different? So think about, like, if you were going to have like a new car, like a new sports car. Well, you wouldn't call it the Turtle and put like a turtle logo on it if it it goes really fast and it goes from 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds, and it's got zip and pickup, and if you take it out on the highway, you can get up to 180 miles an hour. So that you wouldn't call that the Turtle, right? So in the same way, if you have this stable, unchanging material world, how could you ever represent it with these fleeting and ever-changing ideas? Another one of his skeptical arguments is he looks at this concept of substance supporting quality. So what is substance? It's that which supports qualities. So what does support mean? Well, he has this idea support means spread out under. So it's kind of a literal interpretation that for something to support another thing, right? So you have this thing up here, and then you have the thing below it. What does it mean for one to support the other? Well, it's sort of spread out underneath it, holding it up. So that's that. So he says, okay, so we have the substance, and then we have the qualities spread out underneath the substance, and the qualities are holding up the substance. Okay, well, but what about, don't those qualities that let's see, did I have that reversed? Did I have qualities, substance is that which supports qualities, right? So you have the substance spread underneath the qualities. Sorry if I misspoke there. So you have the substance underneath, and it's supporting the qualities that are on top of it. It's sort of spread out underneath those. And he says, but if you think about this concept of being spread out, what does that mean, to be spread out underneath something else? Well, it's a quality of extension, or having size. So the substance is spread out underneath the qualities. That means it has the quality of size. Size is a quality. It itself will need something to support it, right? But if substance is spread out underneath the qualities, substance itself is going to have the quality of extension, of being spread out, of having size, and it in turn will need another substance to support it. But if that substance is supporting it, it's going to be spread out underneath the first substance, and it's going to have the quality of size or extension, being spread out, and then it itself is going to need another substance to support it, right? And on and on and on, ad infinitum, and you get an infinite regress. And so the idea is that there's something fundamentally incoherent or absurd about the concept of substance. You have one substance supporting another, supporting another, supporting another. And so then Hylas says, well, wait a minute. You're taking me in this sort of wooden, literal sense one thing supporting another, and that's not what I meant. So now Philonis innocently says, okay, well, what did you mean? And Hylas is sort of lost and can't come up with what he means by the sort of metaphorical idea of support. And Berkeley's sort of having some fun with Locke. I think he would say, you call it something I know not what, which supports qualities, and it's like, that's a good name for it. You don't know what you're talking about. It's you don't know what you're talking about. It's something I know not what is just a placeholder for ignorance. So let's see. I'll look at another. Using the whiteboard from last time to avoid my having to draw on something. Sort of low tech here with the phone. Fairly well though. We'll see if we can how it's going to do with the upload. So what is a table? So what would Locke say a table is? Well, a table is a material object with various qualities. Some primary, some secondary, right? So let's say the table might be like square, so that's primary quality, shape. It also has a quality of, say, having a color, like maybe it's blue, so that's, or brown, so that's a secondary quality. We see it as blue or brown because of the way that light bounces off it, which is primary quality. It's the way it affects us. Right? So it's a material object out there which is causing sensations in us, it's giving us simple and complex ideas. And if everything's going right, the table out there represents the idea in our mind represents the table out there in the world. So the idea of the table is this mental copy of the real table out there in the world. Now here's the weird thing, and this is what Berkeley points out: you can never see a table. So you never see the real table. What you see is the idea of the table in your mind, and then you make an inference. You say, well, I'm experiencing these table-like sensations. I'm having simple ideas, and I'm having a complex idea of the table. And I think it's a table out there in the world that's causing it. But why do I think that? Well, I could just be having these sensations for no reason. And Berkeley says, well, maybe God's giving you the sensations. So Locke's version is this kind of a priori argument that a rationalist argument, you can't conceive of qualities existing without their existing in some substance. So you assume there's a real table out there made of material substance causing you to have these sensations. Okay, so Berkeley, what does Berkeley say the table is? Now, Berkeley's going to say you really do perceive the table. Now, it's interesting to ask the question whether everyone has the same idea of the table, because you have different perspectives of the same object, right? But for Berkeley, it's not that you have these different vantage points of the same material object. You have the same. It's all ideas, right? So does each person have a slightly different idea based on their sensations, or are different minds perceiving the same ideas? In other words, you treat an idea like a material object, and Berkeley doesn't really give you an answer to that. He kind of goes both ways, and it's hard to know what his considered opinion is. But what does Berkeley say? A table is not an object made of material substance. And what Berkeley says is that a table is a collection of qualities, which is the same thing as saying for Berkeley, it's a collection of ideas. Remember, for Locke, quality is the thing out there in the world, then the idea is the thing in your mind. For Berkeley, there's no out there in the world, it's all in your mind, right? So Um, so a table is just a collection of qualities, which is another way of saying a collection of ideas. Or you might say a table is just a complex idea. Now it doesn't represent anything, it exists on its own. And it's an idea given to you by God. Whether you get your own tailor-made ideas from moment to moment, or whether you and the guy next to you are having the same idea and sharing an idea, Berkeley doesn't really give you a definitive view on, or people argue about it, so I won't ask that on the test. So it's all ideas. God is giving each one of us ideas from moment to moment, and that's our experience. So again, it's like the arch deceiver, except for God's not really deceiving us. We're deceiving ourselves if we buy into this concept of material substratum that the philosophers like Locke have cooked up. Okay. Now, let's see. So now, what about the distinction between primary and secondary qualities? What's Berkeley going to say about that? He completely rejects it. So if you think about it, it makes sense that how can you have primary and secondary qualities if there's no distinction between out there in the world and in my mind? Because remember, a secondary quality is a quality that's not really out there in the object in the material world, but it's something in part created by my sensory apparatus. There's something about the color red that the red sensations come from the cones in my eyes, right? It's not, you can see this painting up here. Oh, we have orange, we've got blue, right? So that orange there, that orange color there, it's not really out there in the painting, Locke would say. It's in part in your mind. It's the way your eye interprets that particular wavelength of light. So even though there is something going on that in the objective material world, a wavelength of light bouncing into your eyes, it's the orange sensation is something that's created by our sensory apparatus. Give you something interesting to look at besides my ugly mug here. And let's see. So color and shape exist in the same place. So, and then Berkeley again makes this argument. Look at some colors and shapes again. So, could you ever see, like in order to see a shape of any kind, like an orange shape, you have to have a background, right? So you have orange in one place, but then you have yellow on the borders, right? And a little bit of green. So, and then you get the blue over there. So in order for that orange segment to stand out, and say for the blue segments to stand out on the sort of striped straw looking things, you need to...
May I have your attention, please? All passengers on the left.
No, you may not. You need to have a background. You need to set out an object from its background. So that's the shape and color always go together. And so Berkeley is going to say shape and color are both just in your mind. They're experiences that your creator is giving you from moment to moment. Oh, and here's the substance and quality thing. So I skipped ahead a little bit here. So again, Locke says substance is that which supports qualities, and then you have this idea. Okay, so the substance got to be spread out underneath the qualities, and then he says to support qualities, substance must be spread out under them. But to be spread out under is the quality of extension or size. And this quality of extension itself requires support from another substance. So you get substance 2 supporting substance 1, and then you need substance 3 supporting substance 2, and this goes on to infinity. And so the idea is that any theory which gives you an infinite regress like this has to be faulty. There's got to be something logically wrong with it. Oh, and I have this on slide 4 too. How can something fleeting and ever-changing represent something stable and unchanging? So another one of his arguments, again, trying to poke holes in this concept of matter. He's trying to show that this is sort of his he's got both his positive view and his negative view. So his negative view, he's going to attack the concept of matter, try to show that leads to paradoxes, to contradictions, to problems, and shows that it's not something that's common sense, it's not something that's given in your experience, it's something that's been cooked up by philosophers to try to tear down your faith in God. And there's no reason to believe in it. If you're a real empiricist, you have to go with some form of rationalism in order to believe in substance. Okay, and then let's see. Oh, preview the next time. So kind of a weird view. I think we're back, back with the arch deceiver scenario, back with life is but a dream, and it's this. Maybe in your discussion you can talk about maybe it's time to bring back direct realism. Is G.E. Moore right that the existence of the external world is obvious? You just say, oh, here's a hand, right? I only have one hand here because I'm holding the phone. Here's a hand, right? Two objects. Is it that easy? But how do you know, when you wave your hand in the air, how do you know there's actually a hand there? You just have the sensations. So this is, Descartes' idea. How do I know there's a world behind my sensations? How do I know they're just not coming from me? If they're coming from outside of myself, how do I know they're as given? And how do I know they represent a real world? And Descartes has these arguments for God's existence, tries to prove that God is good and is no deceiver, and therefore that knowledge is possible, and that to a certain extent we can trust our senses if they're properly tempered with reason. We can do science, and God set up a world where we can learn things. And now Berkeley thinks this is the case too, but he sort of has an easier go at it. Now, interestingly, you might find this surprising, but Berkeley wasn't just a bishop, but he also did some pioneering works in optics. So Berkeley's actually a scientist with this kind of kooky theory, or is it? But Berkeley's a scientist. He wrote a text on optics, and he's well aware of science. So it's not like he's some kind of religious nut who's out to deny scientific study. But what he does say is, what are we doing when we're doing science? Aren't we just making observations with the senses? And as good empiricists, should we just stick to the senses? Why refer to this material world, which cannot be sensed by any of the five senses, and use that as part of our scientific theories? Why not just go whole hog empiricism and just go with what can be sensed? So what do we have experiences of? Well, we have experiences of the five senses. We have these sensations. We have ideas, which are sort of abstracted sensations. And then we have minds, and we're aware of the operations of our own minds. I think he has sort of a similar idea to Locke's ideas of reflection. He thinks you have a personal experience of your own mind, and then he thinks you also have an experience of God's mind when he gives you sensations. So let's come back to this to be is to be perceived for a minute. So here's a question, and this is one that Hylas asked. So the books of my study, right? So I shut off the light and close the door and leave. I'm not perceiving my books anymore. do they still exist? Well, here's an interesting thing that Hylas said, or that Philonis says. He says, well, yes, they do still exist. Why? Because God's perceiving the books. God always perceives everything. So God is sort of takes the place of the material world. God is what gives the stability and order to the material world. God always perceives the books even when nobody else is. He sees the books in your study even when the lights are off. God can see in the dark. This is why you get you have this. I included this poem by Ronald Knox. It's kind of funny. Let me see if I can read it here. And I'll be our last thing. Let's see. Oh, I don't have my text. Let me see if I can call it up here. It's actually surprising that I got such a quiet place here. I'll try to give you something more scenic next time. Let's see. Here's like a nice people keep on looking at this window, this architectural thing here. Give you a look at that. Here's the long hallway. This is kind of cool though. This big hangar type thing here. Okay, let me see if I can find this poem. I've got it plugged in, otherwise I'd walk over there. Yeah, that's on my laptop. I don't want to just yank it out while I'm recording here. Let's see. There we go. Okay. KNOX.
Please help our police officers by being aware of your surroundings and reporting any
Here,
unsafe acts or suspicious behavior to airport authorities.
I'll do this here.
Thank you for helping us to keep PDX safe.
Stand up a little bit here. So you can see the painting in full. Very colorful. And hanger there on the window. Okay. Hopefully you're not getting vertigo by this. Sometimes people get motion sickness from these moving this thing around too much. Here we go. This is on page 128. And I paid $1.50 for a banana and a glass of ice water. I got my peach mango drink in there. So I should have brought some water. Okay, let's see. This is my good side. I think this is my good side. I've been doing it from my bad side. Okay. So this is the questions for review. And I got it. Mr. Enriquez still hasn't recovered his stuff. Okay. So this is, you go over these questions for review. They'll help prepare you for the exam. So, first question: what reasons did Berkeley give for rejecting Locke's representationalism? In particular, how does he attack the concept of matter? We talked about that. So, the second question: what does Berkeley mean when he says "to be is to be perceived"? And how does the following limerick illustrate it? There once was a man who said God must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Replied, dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad. And that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. Okay, so what's this little limerick about? Well, the idea is that it's the same as the books and study example, right? So Berkeley says to be is to perceive, for something to exist means that someone is having some experience. So you have this tree out in the quad, no one's looking at it, no one is having experience of it. So what does it just pop out of existence? And this is a skeptical argument against Berkeley. It seems like an absurd idea that objects could just pop out of existence all of a sudden, and we don't have that in our experience. So, but Berkeley's going to say, well, of course objects don't pop out of experience, but that's because God's always perceiving everything, and so even when no one's looking at that tree in the quad, God still perceives it, and so that's why it continues to exist. So to be is to be perceived is still valid.
Please proceed to baggage claim carousel number 6. See the Frontier Airlines agent for a message.
Now here's an interesting question. This is number 3. Berkeley claims he in no way denies the existence of real things, but merely gives the concept of a real thing its proper definition. What are real things, according to Berkeley? So that's a good question. What is a real? Well, Berkeley would say a real thing is an idea. That, like, what is a cherry? A cherry is the red, round, sweet thing, right, with the hard pit. A cherry is not object made of material substance. That's not what we mean when we talk about a cherry. That's not what you want when you say, oh, this cherries look good. And you think about, oh, if I were to put that cherry in my mouth, I mean, it'd be sensations of sweetness and redness, and maybe if I eat enough of them, my hunger will be satiated, and maybe if I eat too many of them, I'll get sick, right? So you have all these associations with cherries, and what is it about? It's about your actual possible experiences with this object. So it's about, and I didn't even talk about the object, right? What is the object? It's just, the object is a red, round, sweet thing with the characteristic cherry taste. Those are all sensations, and then you're not talking about material substance. You're talking about actual and possible sensations. So that's just what a cherry is. It's not an object made of material substance. It's the name of a collection of sensations you have, or a collection of ideas, or to put another way, a collection of qualities. Remember, there's no difference between quality and idea in Berkeley. You could say that real things are complex ideas, right? So Berkeley's real things are Locke's complex ideas, but they don't represent anything, right? There's no material substance. There's just the ideas that God gives us from moment to moment. What role does God play in Berkeley's system? I suppose that's a fairly obvious one we just said. God gives the world stability. He gives our sensations order. Now here's a question for you to ponder, maybe for next time or maybe in your discussion. So imagine there's a runaway coach. It's careening down the cobblestone street, and Berkeley is in the middle of the street crossing. The question is, does he step aside, or does he allow himself to be run over? Because after all, it's not a real coach. It's not made of material substance. It's just an idea. Why should he worry about an idea of a coach? Could an idea of a coach hurt him? So would he jump out of the way? And if Berkeley does jump out of the way, does he show himself to be a hypocrite? Does he show that he really believes in the external world of matter? So chew on that, maybe discuss it with Dave in the discussion. Anything else about that we've talked about over the last hour, you should discuss with Dave. Post to the forum. I'll have the topics up as soon as I can. I'll do it Monday or maybe Tuesday morning. Send me any little messages you might have. If you are perplexed about something, if you want some input, if you want to run an idea by me, and I'll get to those as I'm able to, and appreciate your bearing with me with this trip. And this is a bit of an experiment here. It's something that's sort of foisted at me on short notice.